Beth Johnson is one of the founders of Speak Up for Women and is a current spokeswoman for Speak Up for Women, which is a women's rights group that was formed in 2018 to oppose the government's sex self-identification bill. Beth is a mother and a marketing and communications professional. Kia ora, Beth. So my first question is, Beth, would you please introduce yourself, including some details of the area in which you have focused your activism advocating for women's sex-based rights? What legislation, policy, or practice currently concerns you?
Yeah, in 2018, I was blissfully unaware of the fact that there was any threat to women's rights, and could probably describe myself as just a relaxed feminist of no particular action. And then I found out about sex self-identification law, first of all, what was happening in the UK, and then became aware that the same thing was happening in New Zealand. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. So that really awoke the feminist fire in me, and with a bunch of really fantastically smart people, I brought basically the comms and marketing to the formation of Speak Up for Women, and so helped build that organisation, and we've been running it ever since. And we formed in 2018 to fight sex self-identification, which was being slipped through without public consultation in New Zealand. So we fought really hard and ran a public awareness campaign to stop the government doing that change. It was a really poorly thought through piece of legislation that would allow people to self-identify their sex on their birth certificate. So that is falsifying their birth certificate via nothing more than a statutory declaration, which is signing a piece of paper declaring that they're the opposite sex. And so we ran a campaign pointing out the legal flaws and the knock-on effects this would have to other bills in New Zealand, that it would actually conflate the separate concepts of sex and gender in our laws. Now, off the back of that campaign, the government actually deferred that bill in 2019. So they parked it, they stopped it. But now we have a new government. Sex self-identification is back, and it's back with a vengeance. It's just passed its second reading, and the government has just given us less than 3 weeks for public consultation. And New Zealand is in a level 4 COVID lockdown. So that means that Speak Up for Women can't run the campaign that we intended to, which was going to include leafleting and all sorts of meetings to get people making submissions. So it's really undemocratic process. But nonetheless, we will be campaigning really hard over the next couple of weeks, mostly digitally and online. Yeah.
How does this legislation, policy or practice, in this case, the self-ID legislation, affect women's sex-based rights as outlined in the Women's Declaration? What particular rights do you think are affected and why? And what can be done to uphold them?
The main issue that we're focusing on is actually women's rights, which is an existing right covered in our own Human Rights Act legislation here in New Zealand, but also international conventions for women and girls to have single-sex spaces and services for reasons of privacy, dignity and safety. Now that is undermined by allowing sex self-identification. Probably everyone on this call is well aware of that issue. The bill, which has just gone through its second reading and is now open to public consultation, is actually better than it was in its original form. So when we were campaigning in 2018 and 2019, the bill, it was really unclear if the lawmakers meant to conflate or maintain the separation between the concepts of sex and gender. The new bill makes it clearer that sex and gender are different, and it actually says, paraphrasing, that a birth certificate is no longer reliable evidence of sex. So it's allowing people to nominate a sex on their birth certificate, but it's also saying a birth certificate isn't definitive evidence of your sex for the purposes of accessing single-sex spaces and services. So as far as we're concerned, that's an improvement on the legal wording. And we're really glad that the campaign that so many people on this call ran in 2018, 2019 actually brought about that change. But our concern is, and what we'll be focusing our submissions on during this public consultation, is how will that work in practice? How will single-sex service providers resolve any doubt or dispute about someone's eligibility for access to a single-sex service? Because there won't be any New Zealand identity document anymore that can be relied upon to provide evidence of sex. So a service provider can't ask, to see any piece of paper that will resolve in their mind for them if this person is a male or a female. And original birth records will be sealed. So it will only be the Justice Department that will actually be able to access anybody's original birth records. Certainly a provider of a female gym or a spa won't have access to those records. So as it stands, they're going to have to risk going to court, for example, to discover somebody's birth sex if they want to exclude a male-presenting male person from their service who happens to have a birth certificate saying they're female. So our concern is really that practical implementation. And we are concerned that women's service providers will simply allow males access to avoid this confusing area, because there's no clear way now of resolving any conflicts, and thus it undermines women's existing rights, even though the law professes to intend to uphold the existing rights. So that's the main concern. In terms of what we can do to resolve it, we need everybody to make public submissions, because it's not the law yet. And so we'll share with everyone on this call the links to, we're publishing next Wednesday some guidance on how to make submissions, and we've obtained some legal advice that's informing those that guidance. So by middle of next week, we'll be ready to make our submissions, and we'd love for everyone to pitch in on that. It's really important that people make submissions, the more the merrier.
We're looking to the future now with question 3. So Beth, what are your suggestions for future directions for New Zealand to protect women's sex-based rights and to uphold the rights in the Women's Declaration?
Yes, I think it's really important that firstly we continue to pressure the government, and then potentially run a campaign directly to service providers to make them aware of their existing rights, because your average beautician or spa or gym owner is not going to be aware of the fact that they still have the right to exclude a male person who presents a female birth certificate. So it's really important that the people who actually run these services are aware of their rights. So that's one thing. I think as Di's talked about, the education that's going on in our schools, we have to combat that, because our children are going to grow up and be the adults of the future, and they need to understand their rights and the importance of sex-based rights and feminism. So really focusing on that area is going to be key. We'll be preparing for the inevitable test case that will come before our courts once this law passes, and when somebody with a self-identified birth certificate is denied access to a single-sex service, that will ultimately end up in courts, and that court decision will be really pivotal in our society's understanding of our sex-based rights. So yeah, those are the main ones, and I think one we haven't even talked about yet, which is on the horizon in New Zealand, is surrogacy legislation. And I think it's another issue that's going to impact the lowest socioeconomic group of New Zealand more so than others. When you can buy women's bodies to make babies, that's on the horizon, coming soon.